All right, so I'm going to talk about the issue of strategy, the whole question of why. And why do I do this mapping stuff? So yes, I built several companies, sold them all to sort of big US giants, except for one to a Japanese giant. I work with all sorts of wonderful organizations doing interesting stuff. At the heart of this is something called mapping. So I want to talk about where mapping came from. And then I want to talk about what is a map. Then I want to get into patterns. And at the end of this, I've got a bit of stuff all about organization and structure as well, which is where we'll talk about something called the Pioneer Settler Town Planner structure. Now, I put a dotted line because it depends on questions, depends upon time. And by the way, do ask questions as we go along. Do just shout out if there's something you want to ask. Okay, so I better start with the origin story of why mapping. So many years ago, and this is back in 2004 2005, I was working for this company. It was called For Tango, online photo service. It was doing very well, had about 16 different lines of business, about 10 million users in total across all these different lines of business. Very profitable, growing rapidly, but it had a problem. And the problem wasn't the marketing or engineering or anything along those lines. The problem was the CEO. The CEO didn't have a clue what they were doing. Completely clueless. And I know this because I was the CEO. We used to have lots of wonderful, I used to make up all sorts of vision statements and strategy statements and things like this. But they were all just made up. So back in 2003, our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. We're a heavy technology-led company. We'd adopted something called extreme programming as a methodology throughout the entire organization. XP was designed by a friend of mine, Kent Beck. And we were heavy providers of open source technology, and we were doing all this great online business, and we were growing rapidly. But the problem with this statement was literally I pinched it from another company and changed a few words. And so I was sort of worried that people would eventually rumble that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I used to go around listening to all these other CEOs talking about, CTOs and CIOs and others talking about strategy. And I used to take a tape recorder basically with me. And I wore pen and paper. And I used to record the talks and write down the key words. And I called them business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And I've done this every couple of years. So this was probably, about 2013. The common BLAS I would hear were things like digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. And then what I did was I took a whole bunch of strategy statements from different companies and created what I called the BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I simply smashed them together and randomly generated 64 different strategies. And I've done this exercise several times. So things like this: our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage and disruptive social media to build a collaborative revolution. I mean, I feel my soul is just dying at these words. But I would send these around, and I'd get 3 basic responses back from people. Either this is the exact wording from our business plan, or I've seen 2 of these used already, and the third of my favorite was, are you for hire? So I was in this position doing very well, revenue growing, profit growing, and I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. And I had started getting the impression that others were just making it up as they went along as well. So I was reading everything I could, every strategy book, and I was getting absolutely nowhere. Nothing was really making sense to me. But I was still worried that people would find out that I was faking it. So I ended up in a bookshop, and I was talking to the bookseller, and they said, had you read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? And I went, no. And so they persuaded me to buy 2 different copies of the book because they're all translations, so they're all different. And at the same time this was going on, by the way, friends of mine put this all online. The whole strategy generators all online. You just type in the URL, it will automatically generate you one now based on nothing. And if you don't like it, just press refresh. Anyway, so I was sitting there in this bookshop, and I'm being persuaded. So I buy these 2 copies of the book, and I go back, and I'm really grateful because it was in the reading of the second version. I noticed that Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. First, understand your landscape, the area you're competing in. Next, understand the climatic patterns, the heavens, as it's called it. So this is how the landscape is changing, the weather. Then you orientate yourself around this with doctrine. And then you get into the leadership bit, which is about, how you where the sort of games that you play. And of course, you've got your purpose, what you're trying to do. I was quite excited by this. This sort of made sense to me. And then I came across John Boyd. So John Boyd was a US Air Force pilot, came up with something called the OODA loop, very popular in political circles. And so we'll just overlay that. So you've got the game, your purpose. The first O of the OODA loop is to observe the environment, which is landscape and climatic patterns. So what does the environment look like and how is it changing? Then you need to orientate yourself around this with doctrine. And then you need to decide where you're going to act. And then you act. And it's a cycle. And as you go around the cycle, your action may change your purpose, and it will change the landscape. And climatic patterns, the weather will change the landscape. And then climatic patterns in terms of business, we call them economic patterns. So I was quite excited by this. And at the heart of this, there are 2 whys. There's the why of purpose, as in moral imperative to do something, and the why of movement. Why do I make this move over that move? So it's a bit like playing a game of chess. Your why of purpose might be to win the game. Your why of movement is, do I move this piece over that piece? So this sort of all made sense to me, and I was quite happy. But when I was looking at that cycle, and I was thinking about how do we do this, I started getting into military history. Because I picked up those words, landscape, and I thought, well, military, we do lots of strategy, and I did lots of strategy in military. And so I started going back through military history, and one of the things suddenly occurred to me was they use a lot of maps. So this is the Battle of Thermopylae, very simple. Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, has a problem. Persians are invading, about 170,000 Persians. What he decides to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians into along coastal road into a narrow pass, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. And so there are about 4,000 Greeks, independent city-states, and in that there are 300 Spartans, and this is where we get the story of the 300 from. And so it was like, you can see how you can talk about people working together on a map, and we can use it as a learning environment. And so I started thinking, well, landscape. How do I look at my landscape? And one of the tools that I was using was something called a SWOT. And I used lots of different tools, but I used lots of SWOTs. And I thought, right, well, let me do a SWOT of this battle and see what happens. So I did Themistocles SWOTs. So to make it simple, strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, high-level motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. Threats: the Persians get rid of us. And the oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. So I put these side by side and just asked myself the question, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by some sort of map or some sort of SWOT, magic framework. And I realized that everything in my business was all about magic frameworks. I was using SWOTs and all sorts of various instruments for creating business cases. But we didn't seem to be having this sort of discussion about the landscape. So I got into trying to understand why this was. Was this real? Was it just me just not knowing what was going on? What was it? What is it about a map? So I grabbed various people in the organization, got them together and said, where are our maps? We must have maps. And we had loads of maps. We had business process maps, we had mind maps, we had systems maps. Great. So I took one map, system map. And this was a system map for a particular line of business that we had. And it had various components within it. CRM stands for customer relationship management, doesn't matter. What I did was I took a component and I just moved it from there to there. And I said, right, how has the map changed? And the answer is, well, it hasn't. Still the same components, still the same connections. And I said, well, if I take an atlas and I take Australia and I shift it next to England, has that map changed? And the answer is, well, of course it has. Well, that's because that's a map, and this is not a map. This is a graph. And in fact, everything in business that we had, which we called a map, was in fact a graph. Business process maps are graphs. Mind maps are graphs. They're all graphs. And just to explain the difference, the three diagrams at the top are all graphs, and they're identical. So Nottingham, London, Dover, 3 places in the UK connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. But the 3 graphs at the top are identical. The 3 maps, the 3 diagrams at the bottom are all different, and they're maps. Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, again, but connected by 2 roads. And the difference between a graph and a map is that in a map, space has meaning. And that comes from having a compass, which is why maps are good for exploring and understanding landscapes. So I thought, great. Everything we've got in business, or everything I had in business, which called itself a map, and I had things like strategy maps and all this sort of stuff, are in fact graphs. We have no maps. So I need to create a map. So what are the key characteristics of a map? Well, you have to have an anchor. So in geographical maps, that's magnetic north. You have to have position of pieces. So this is north, south, east, or west of that. And then you have to have the idea of consistency of movement. So when I go north, I'm going north. When I go south, I'm going south, east, east, etc. Okay. So I needed to recreate that for a competitive landscape. So being a Brit, I like cups of tea. So I started with a tea shop. So I thought, right, what's my anchor going to be? I decided to use the user as the anchor, or the consumer of something. And so we could have the public consumer, we could have the business, we could have regulators, as in government. Okay, so if that's my anchor, what am I going to build it around? So I started with need. So the user has a need for a cup of tea. And hopefully the business has a need to sell cups of tea. We're a tea shop. Great. Now, a cup of tea has needs. A cup of tea, it needs a cup, it needs hot water needs a kettle, cold water, kettle needs power. So what I've now got is anchors at the top and position described through a partially ordered chain of needs. And the further something away, further down the chain it is, the further away, less visible it is. So to the public, a cup of tea is very visible to them. The power you use to heat the kettle is not very visible. So I've got anchor and position, but I need to describe movement. It turned out that pretty much all forms of capital, whether activities, practices, data, or even ethical values, evolve through 4 common stages. And for activities, we use the labels Genesis, custom built, product, and commodity. So all I had to do was take that value chain and just say, right, how evolved are these components? And there we are. I just put the components in how evolved they are. Now I've got anchor, position, and movement, and this is a map. And if I change or move anything on this, it changes the context and the meaning. So this enabled somebody else to go, well, hang on a minute, you're missing components. You're missing, say, staff. Somebody else would go, we don't want staff, we want to use robots. Somebody else would go, well, hang on, each of these nodes are stocks of capital and each of the lines are flows of capital. So we can actually use this to create P&Ls. And then somebody else would go, you're missing this or that, or we could have the entire discussion. What was happening was the maps created a common language for us. And because we had a common language, we could start to challenge assumptions. So people would say, why is the kettle custom built? Surely we should use standard kettles. And somebody would go, our brand exclusivity. So it didn't matter whether it was marketing, operation, finance, or whatever it was. We could all talk about a singular environment and we could challenge assumptions. Sounds very simple. I'll give you an example of practical use. This is an insurance company. And they had a particular project to basically, they were doing a digital transformation, which involved investing a whole bunch of money in robots. The problem they're solving is this. They need compute. They would order a server, and the server goes into goods in. They would modify, mount, and rack the compute, the servers into their racks. And they had a bottleneck around this. So they decided they were going to invest a huge amount of money into robots to deal with this, because it's all about improving the process flow. It wasn't a huge amount of money. It was tens of millions, but so that was the plan. And they'd spent 6 months working on this, very bright people. And the problem is, this was the story they had. They'd got wonderful return on investment calculations, the whole lot. They'd created the story. And if you go in and challenge the story, you're challenging the people themselves. And the reason for this is that we go around persuading everybody that to be a good leader, you need to be a great storyteller, which means stories are highly political, because when you challenge somebody's story, you're challenging the person. So I couldn't go in and ask, why are we spending all this money on robots? I simply asked, can we quickly map this? So it took 10 to 15 minutes, and that's the map. They went, user needs compute. They put compute in product. Compute needs to order server goods in. That's more commodity type stuff. And they put rack, mount, modify. I just looked at this and I just asked a question, why have you got rack in custom built? And it turns out that they had a company that made their racks for them, and they were custom built. So I then asked, what are the modifications you're doing to servers? Well, the servers we buy don't fit our racks. So we have to take the cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. And this is why we need to invest in robotics. Yes, because that process is very faulty. And of course, somebody immediately in the room just went, why are we using standard racks? Now, these people weren't daft. They're very bright people. The problem is they were trapped by context. They were trapped by the stories that we tell each other. So they were doing the sensible thing of improving process flow. Or in fact, what they should have been doing is first concentrating on evolutionary flow. They shouldn't be custom building racks. They should be using commodity. You know, if you do the process flow, you'll just you'll spend money on robots, which you don't need to do. And it's commonplace. I mean, it sounds silly, but if you ask people, you know, if you need a slice of toast, going back to my tea shop, would you buy a toaster for $40? Or would you spend 9 months doing what Thomas Thwaite did, which is building a toaster from scratch, building all the raw, over $1,000? That's what it looked like. First time it created a piece of toast, it burst into flames. Well, it's obvious you'd spend $40 on a toaster. But you'd be amazed at the number of companies when, if the user needs some compute, do you use a compute utility like EC2 or Azure? Or do you spend hundreds of millions building your own? It was amazing the number of companies who were, oh no, we're going to build our own. And this stuff is commonplace. All right. So I'll give you another example. I'll get a heavy engineering example here. This is HS2, high-speed rail. So big trains, massive, great big project. So this is James Fenley. He's a good friend of mine. CIO, was the CIO. He's now doing stuff with the Royal Navy. They needed to build the entire railway in a virtual world because it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we've got that wrong, than it is to dig up the English countryside. Sorry, if there's noise in the background, there's noise in the background. Okay, so they need to build the entire railway in a virtual world. And this is basically the systems diagram for this. And James's problem was this: is how do we go about doing this? Do we outsource it all? Do we build it off-the-shelf products? Do we build it in-house with agile techniques? So this particular diagram, just those three questions, will give you 387 million possible permutations. So how are you going to choose the right one? So in government, what we tended to do was this. We would go, let's outsource the whole lot. and let's break it into little contract structures, which sort of makes sense. We'll have like lot 1 engineering, lot 3 back office, lot 4 infrastructure, lot 2 user experience, because that sounds like user experience stuff. That stuff sounds like engineering. That's how we used to do things. And then we'd have disaster projects. And so James is a good friend of mine. He decided to map it out. So this is the map he produced in his garden on a Sunday afternoon. He sent it to me. I quickly tidied it up. So this was the map, and then he asked the question, how do we manage this? Well, I made that mistake of going all agile in adopting extreme programming everywhere in 2004, 2003. And of course, had learnt it hadn't worked. And by 2005, I had mapping. So I learned how to use multiple methods. So it's pretty simple. When it comes to methodology, agile extreme programming, very good on the left, lean, very good in the middle, Six Sigma, very good in the right. It's the same with finance. So very much venture capital on the left. And then as you move across, you get through, more outcome based, then more COTS, then finally utility based approaches. There's no such thing as one size fits all methodologies, whether it's finance or marketing or even project management. So once you've got this, you go, right, agile over here, lean in the middle, Six Sigma on the right. It's really simple. You just take your map and you apply it. You say the stuff on the right we should outsource, stuff in the middle, off the shelf products, stuff on the left, build in-house, agile techniques. And so he did this, and this ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee, because this part of the project was way ahead of schedule, way under budget, because they used appropriate methods. Simple as that. Now, typically, what we would do in government is we would just like outsource the whole lot and break it into contracts. And if I just take one contract here, lot 1 engineering, I can show you what would have happened. That's the mapping form. I've just overlaid lot 1 engineering, and we've outsourced the whole lot. Now, before we've even signed the paperwork, I can tell you that the bits on the right-hand side will be efficiently treated because we can define them. They're industrialized, they're product commodity, they're more known. The bits on the left-hand side will always incur excessive change control costs. So the project will fail before we've even started. And I often get dragged into, people have got this huge, great big contract, 200 million, 300, 400 million, and they spent ages doing it. You simply map it out, overlay the contract, and you can say like this are all going to fail before you've even signed the paperwork, before you've even got started, because you're going to try and specify things which can't be specified. Anyway. So mapping, we do quite a bit in government. I mean, this is a good friend of mine, James Finley. He's now at AWS, runs their AWS Institute, does lots of the AWS government stuff. I mean, just one project alone, just by simply mapping it, we saved about 425 million. I mean, we saved billions on that particular project, and 1.5 billion in its lifetime. But the other thing that was good about this stuff is that once people started map, they would share them. And so we'd get maps on borders, police and immigration. And we had a group called Spend Control, which would challenge and share information. And the point is, once you get many of these maps, you can start to pull out common points. And we used to find, duplication and bias in all different parts of the map. So we'd find we're building the same thing over here that we're building in this group over here, et cetera, et cetera. And often we'd find, we'd get 10 of something which is a commodity and somebody over here is custom building it because they don't know it exists. Now, I thought duplication was bad in government. The worst example I've got in government is 118 workflow systems doing exactly the same thing. We managed to build prisoner registration about 118 different ways. The worst I've got in the private sector, I've got a particular global finance company. They've managed to build risk management over 1,000 times. I mean, they've stopped counting. Anything you think about government, when it comes to waste and inefficiency, it's always far worse than the private sector. I mean, government is almost like a bastion of efficiency compared to some of the horrors that I get to see in the private sector. All right, so I started to talk about why Matt. Well, I didn't know what I was doing. We were being successful, but I didn't know why. And then I got into this whole area of the strategy cycle and the importance of understanding the landscape. So then I explained what is a map. Now I want to go through some patterns. So there's three basic patterns that you need to be aware of. One are climactic patterns. These are like the rules of the game, how the environment changes. One is doctrine, so these principles of organization. And the last one is leadership and gameplay. Now there's a vast number of these. There's about 30 climactic patterns, 40 doctrine, up about 100 different forms of gameplay. Most people are oblivious to all of this, but I'm just going to show you some simple examples. So I'll start with a map of compute. This is back in 2005. So user requires an application built on best coding practice, built on some sort of runtime, built on some sort of operating system, built on some sort of best architectural practice, built on compute. And compute was a product as in servers back in 2005. Now, the first pattern you learn is everything evolves. If there's supply and demand competition, then things will evolve. They'll move from the genesis of novel and new, custom built examples, products, eventually commodity. It just will happen. So we knew that things like utility compute, or what got called cloud, would happen. The second pattern you learn is you have inertia. There's about 16 different forms, but they all come from past success. So one of my favorite examples of this is Blockbuster and Netflix. And the reason why it's one of my favorite is Blockbuster was first with a website, first with video ordering online, first with video streaming. Blockbuster out-innovated the entire market, but they went bankrupt first. And that is because they had inertia created by past success, mostly late fees. It was a business model whereby you take the videos home, you forget to bring them back, you pay more money. They made so much money from late fees. And that's created the inertia to adopting a streaming business. Netflix didn't have that problem. So it's not that Blockbuster was a dinosaur and it could innovate. It could out-innovate anyone. It just had inertia from past success. The next pattern you get is co-evolution. So as things evolve, you often get a change of practice as the underlying technology evolves. And it doesn't matter whether I talk about the age of oil, the age of electricity, or Fordism, or whatever it happens to be, you get changes of practice connected to the underlying technology. So the last one was, well, major one is compute. So think about compute as a product, going to compute as a utility, cloud. We got a change of practice, which was eventually called DevOps. And of course, as things evolve to more of a utility, you get those new practices. It enables you to build new needs, new things. So you get new companies like Netflix. And of course, those new needs create new markets, new value. So the next pattern you learn is that higher order systems create new system sources of work. So very simple. All right. How would you use a map like this? So actually, that was a map that I put together. It was about 2008, just to show the change that was going on. I was running strategy for a friend of mine. He's a billionaire astronaut called Mark Shuttleworth, runs a company called Canonical. They provide Ubuntu. And we simply used the map. And I said, look, these are the areas that we need to invest, and that's where we need to avoid. So this was back in 2008. We want to avoid all the best architectural practice, compute as a product. We want to own these different spaces. I mean, the emerging practice wasn't called DevOps at the time. It shortly became DevOps, but we knew this is where we need to focus. Now, we were about 2 to 3% of the operating system market, up against Microsoft and Red Hat, who were absolute giants. It took me 18 months, cost me $500,000, and we took 70% of all cloud computing with Ubuntu. And the reason why we're able to do that is we're playing a game against other people who can't see the board. So you can do all sorts of things. Great fun. All right. So the emerging practice continued to evolve, got a name DevOps. Runtime is evolving. It's become serverless in 2014. That's creating a new set of emerging practice, new needs being created. And the point about this is strategy is iterative. So if you were going to, where would you focus today? You would focus up the stack in the serverless space. I mean, all the stuff like DevOps and the underlying, that's all heading towards new legacy now. So you wouldn't start there. That's gone. That's where you would be in 2010. Well, not in 2010 anymore. It's 2021. So you move up the stack. Okay. So that's climatic patterns, and things like everything evolves, supply and demand, competition. Then you get sort of doctrine. These are universally useful principles like challenge assumptions, have a common language. You also get a gameplay, and there's about 100 different forms. I'll just mention one. One of my favorite is ILC. So just to explain this, you take something, it doesn't matter what it is, which is a product, you turn it into a utility, you enable everybody else to build on top. You publicly expose it. Now, those people will hopefully build interesting things. A lot of it will be complete nonsense. So if we take compute, you turn it into a utility, they build on top, they might build kit and internet, they might build something useful. Well, what you can do is mine the metadata. You never look at people's data. Their data is their data. But what you can do is look at the consumption of your service, which is the metadata. So if you see that somebody's consuming a lot of your service, you know there's something interesting going on over there. So you discover people are growing who all happen to be doing something about big data. So what you do is you now produce big data as a service, or maybe Elastic Map Reduce. And everybody cheers except for those you've just gobbled up. Everybody else cheers because they've got a new component they can build even faster. The ones who don't cheer are the ones, as I said, you've just eaten their business model. Anyway, it's very simple. It's a model called innovate, leverage, commoditize. You get everybody else to innovate for you. You mine the metadata, you leverage the entire ecosystem to spot new patterns, and you commoditize to new component services. And now your rate of innovation, customer focus, efficiency all simultaneously increase with the size of the ecosystem. So the more people building on top, the faster you get in terms of innovation, customer focus, efficiency simultaneously. Okay. And that's basically how Amazon plays the game. It's great. They basically Amazon focuses on industrialization. So they industrialize compute, people build on top. You never look at people's data. People's data is their data. What you look at is the consumption of your service, which is your data, because you've got to build people. And so, they use it to tear up different lines of value chains. In fact, the second ever book that Amazon has written, which is Reaching Cloud Velocity, has 17 pages of mapping in there, and they go through it as well. So I strongly recommend have a read of the book. But that ILC model is actually in there. It's very, very simple. So I suppose some final comments on patterns. First of all, maps are imperfect representations of a landscape. Okay, there is no such thing as a perfect map. So even if I look at, say, a geographical map, a map of France, it's not a perfect map of France. In order to be perfect, it would have to be one-to-one scale. It would have to be the size of France. In fact, it would have to be France. So all maps are simply representations of a space. They're imperfect. And because it's based upon a model of evolution and all models are wrong, they're also imperfect and wrong. But despite the fact they're imperfect and wrong, they turn out to be useful. Great ways of us discussing the environment, discussing changes of learning patterns. So they're not right, they're wrong, they are imperfect, but they turn out to be useful. We use them a lot in government and save billions, but saving money is one side. I mean, I like this sort of stuff. We use them in things like smart cities, where we're trying to generate new industries. I particularly like this sort of work. So James has been using it within RNLI. They've managed to get call out times, which actually saves lives. I like that sort of stuff. Maps also get used in a lot of NGOs as well. So there's a lot of work going on in, combating illegal fishing and combating slavery, and there's a whole bunch of mapping being done in that sort of space, which is always great. Maps are all over the world. So these are friends of mine, venture capitalists, obviously in Silicon Valley, but these are venture capitalists in India. They've got about 60 startups now, all using mapping to attack their industries. They've got incredible revenue rates as well. So mapping isn't just Well, it's all over the world. It's taught Harvard, Kennedy, Peking University, Moscow Institute of Technology. So it's spreading. There's a whole bunch of books. There's about 12 books on mapping out there. The UN Global Platform is all written with maps as well. You even get science fiction books now, like Punch and Scroll, built on maps. Most of my stuff looks at things like nation state competition. So entire industries, automotive industries. China's fantastic at playing the games in terms of the use of strategic investment. It really is spectacular. And issues like digital sovereignty, which is one of the most funniest subject there is, because when we talk about physical sovereignty, obviously we use maps because we need to know where the borders are. And of course we can map the competitive landscape and look at the impact of, values and AI and all the rest of it through basically training data to impose, a collective's behaviors and values into other societies. And we can do that with maps, but of course we don't. It's mostly full of storytellers with no maps at all. It's a bit like doing physical sovereignty with no maps. It's fairly farcical. So I want to talk about organization. So this is me many, many years ago running for Tango, and I sort of made every mistake you could possibly imagine. The first thing I did was 2002. I'd organized by typical silos, CFO, CBO, that sort of thing, just dots representing groups of people. And what would happen is we used to get lots of fights in between the different silos. So I came up with a cunning plan. I thought, well, I know what we need to do. We need to create like small teams we'll put people in charge. We'll call them product owners. And we'll have people from different skill sets in each of those small teams. And that will make everything wonderful. And what happened is I got more fights, but now within the small teams as well as between the silos. So then I came up with this idea that the problem was that some bits of it was new and some bits of it was sort of more core. And so I would split into sort of new, dev, and core. And that just all created all-out warfare. This was bimodal about 8 years before Gartner did bimodal. It's a disaster case. And so to explain what's happening is why it all went wrong is I had my core services and I had these new teams building new things. And then as things evolved, this new team would go to the sort of core services team and say, you look after this. And the core team would go, where's the documentation? And then it'd be all out fight, arguments and everything else. And then the new team would then start building new things on top of what they had, and nothing was evolving. And in fact, by splitting it into core and dev, I'd exacerbated this problem even more. Basically created two warring factions, almost destroyed the company. So I was getting increasing instability and open warfare. Okay. And what I realized is I needed 3 different types of people. I call them pioneers, settlers, and town planners, and they have different characteristics. You need all 3. All 3 are brilliant. So pioneers deal with the creation of the novel and new, the genuinely novel and new. Settlers are the people who take the sort of those ideas, which pioneers build and run and operate, take those ideas, they steal them and turn them into stuff that is useful. And the town planners are like your Amazons of the world. They take that stuff and they industrialize it, massive scale. Okay. I reorganized the entire company to chief pioneer, chief settler, chief town planner. So we had attitudes coming up and down with aptitudes like finance, purchasing, marketing, engineering running across. And then simply would create small cells with common attitudes and then introduce what was known as the system of theft. So the town planners would steal the work of the settlers, forcing the settlers to move on, and steal the work of the pioneers, forcing the pioneers to move on and create the novel and new. And so this created that whole, and in order for pioneers to keep up, they would consume the services of the town planners. So this created this whole cycle where as things changed, they would flow through the organization. Anyway, you can find more about that because GCHQ, which is our intelligence services, has written a wonderful document which is publicly available, Boiling Frogs, and it will. It's all about the need to continuously evolve in highly disruptive, dangerous environments, and you'll see the same structure, slightly different words. Research and innovation portfolio, specialist product portfolio, and commodity portfolio. It's basically pioneers, settlers, town planners. You'll see my stuff referenced there. But here's the problem. I'm always reluctant to talk about pioneer, settler, town planner because people go, oh, we need to reorganize it that way. And then I have to tell them, no, you don't. Because most organizations are like on the Titanic and they've got a great big hole in the side of the boat and there's water flooding in and somebody goes, if we reorganize the deck chairs, everything's going to be fantastic. And the answer is no, you've got to fix the hole first of all. So execs love reaching for reorganization. I have to tell people, don't. Leave it as it is. Let's fix the actual problems first. And most of those problems come from doctrine. So remember I said, principle, have a common language. Another one is challenge assumptions. Another one is use appropriate methods. Well, it turns out there's about 40 universally useful principles that we discovered through mapping. And I've just organized them in phases. Just so phase 1 at the bottom, common language, challenge assumptions, understand what is being considered, know your users, focus on user needs, remove bias and duplication, use appropriate methods, know the details, bias towards data. So just to explain, know the details is know the value chain, understand what is being considered is understand how evolved the component is. Bias towards data is like do a map, make a choice, do a map afterwards, pre-mortem, post-mortem, use the maps to reflect. Now, they build up, they get more complicated. Most organizations are dreadful, even at the most basic ones. They don't have, they don't challenge assumptions. Often they're story-led organizations. You can't challenge the story because if you challenge the story, you're challenging the person. It's highly political, etc. One of the beauties about maps is you take a story, you get them to put it on a map, you tell them the map is wrong. You don't actually challenge them. You're telling them the map is wrong. So you get away from that problem, which is going back to the insurance companies. The only way, I could ask, why have you got rack and custom built? Somebody goes, we've got custom built racks. And then they say, well, why are we doing that? They built up this story. They spent 6 months working on this. And this is so common. People, they're not daft. They're just trapped by these stories. Anyway, this is a really good sort of web giant. They actually, not Amazon. They build and run on Amazon. And they're pretty much, they're very good at most of this doctrine. A couple of areas of weakness, much higher up. And they happily compete and run on top of Amazon. This is the sort of organization that you could, they could do that pioneer settler town planner type thing. This is a bank. This bank, orange is warning, weak is yellow. They're just rubbish at pretty much everything. They don't understand their users, don't have a common language, they barely challenge assumptions, etc. Now, the bank survives because most banks look like this. So it's completely fine to be hopeless as long as everybody else you're competing against is exactly the same. Of course, if they get one of these players come into their space like an Amazon, then they're in trouble, which is why you need to protect your space with the regulatory barriers and all that sort of stuff. But this sort of organization, you wouldn't dream of touching, doing something like Pioneer Settler Town Planner. I mean, I've got friends, Toby and Shopify, they're all mappers, and that's the sort of organization which can go down the path. I mean, Ramon, who built the Spotify, one of them built the Spotify model. And Spotify, by the way, doesn't run the model, which consultants will tell you. I know he was down the whole sort of pioneer settler town plan, but because they had the doctrine and principles in place, you can do that. But get this stuff fixed first. So make sure you know your users, focus on user needs, remove bias and duplication. It's all the boring stuff, but you've got to do that before you can start messing around with those structures. Of course, the problem is when I say that, people say, oh, but we just need to get the right culture. Oh, gosh. All right. This is Krober. Anthropologists who are the experts on culture have spent about 150 years trying to define what culture is, and they can't get agreement. Okay, so I love it when people say, oh, we just got to get the culture right. We can't even define what culture is, and people say we just got to get the culture right. And there's a problem with culture. And the problem with culture is it contains a heck of a lot of different things. And also there are multiple cultures within any single organizations, and every one of you belongs to many cultures. So I've talked about principles, things like use appropriate methods, which are part of doctrine. So these are universally useful patterns. But on that simple map, you've also got multiple values and beliefs. On the left-hand side, you've got people over process. There's a belief. And on the right-hand side, you've got a belief in process over people. So sometimes beliefs are mutually exclusive, sometimes they're not, sometimes they can exist in the same environment as long as they're applied to the right context. Now, beliefs and principles are just a small fraction of what culture actually is. And the reason why anthropologists struggle with defining it is because what Margaret Mead said is that language is a discipline of cultural behavior, i.e. language is part of culture. And because language is part of culture, you can't define culture in language. That's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But you can map it. And so a lot of the stuff that I do is actually mapping cultural systems. And so you get feedback loops and all this sort of stuff as well. You can manipulate things, you can adopt things. You can't just simply take the values of one organization and say, oh, look, they're the values. If we just copy those, magically we'll create that culture. It doesn't work. Because there's so many other bits, including memory and symbols and rituals, etc. But what you can do is you can apply doctrine, so those universally useful patterns, and you can apply universally useful values, which there are only 7, which is things like respect for family, respect for law, etc. Oliver S. Gray's got a nice list of those. But you can apply doctrine, but when you do so, you've got to be mindful of the landscape. And by that, I mean, if I go back to that table of doctrine, focus on user needs, your users will not be the same as the users in defense companies I work with, or the users in, transportation companies. Well, actually, you've got Hermes. It might not be the same as insurance companies. Okay, but the doctrine of focus on users and focus on user needs is the same, but you've got to be mindful of the landscape when you apply it. Of course, this assumes you understand the landscape, which most people don't. So I suppose that's everything. I would just mention one other little added note, which is the whole isolation economy. So user has an existing need, existing practice based upon something. It could be anything. Things evolve. You get co-evolution of practice. You get new needs appearing. Okay, fairly common pattern throughout history. You often get a forcing function. So it drives this change to happen. So back in New York City, turn of the 20th century, 1900s, very early, it was horse manure. City was literally being buried in horse manure because there were so many horses. And that created the forcing function for the adoption of the automobile, which created entire new sets of emerging practice and transformed that city. Well, today we have COVID and the isolation economy. And so what we're getting is a whole new set of new emerging practices being driven by those underlying changes. Now, I have a research team, which is about 11 groups, 60 people, looking at everything from defence to healthcare to government, etc. And there's about 43 different areas of change going on right now, all being driven by underlying industrialization of technology, which is all being accelerated by COVID. It wasn't that these changes weren't going to happen. It's just, it's just the isolation economy. It's just accelerated this process. And so we've got across sustainability, distribution and provision, and the big ones actually turn out to be distributed and indirect learning, swarming of people, particularly things like GameStop and Mask for All, and radicalization, which is coming to a corporate near you as well. So, and by change of practices, I mean we're learning to operate because the physical space has become virtual. It's just about industrialization of that. So if I think about a more general map, business people, what do they want? Work, social interaction, they want status. Well, if you start going down the list of work, you've got learning, collaboration, inclusion, and that's all connected to physical practices, connected to physical spaces. And the status is obviously connected down to things like buildings, top floor offices, all that sort of stuff. And what we're seeing is, of course, the physical space has gone virtual. We've got entire companies of 40,000 people now working as a real estate company. They operate entirely in a virtual world. Quite amazing. So as things have moved to the virtual, accelerated by COVID, it was happening anyway. And what's underneath this is online collaboration tools, video conferencing, etc. We've got entire new virtual practices emerging around inclusion, learning, collaboration. And of course, people trying to recreate status, because one of the big barriers of inertia to change is status and the loss of building, the loss of the top floor office, the fact that it doesn't matter if you're 6'3" and beautiful blonde hair on a Zoom call anymore, you can't lean over, all that stuff is going. And we can either adapt or, some people are desperately trying to get us back into those offices. Anyway, so that's me. I started off with the issue of, why I got into maps, a little bit about what a map is. I took you through some very simple examples of practices, including doctrine and basic economic patterns, how things evolved. I mean, I use it for things from contract analysis to investment strategy to organizational models, because it turns out that looking at your environment is probably a good idea before you make a decision.